The photograph was found during a 2023 digitization project at the Willow Creek Historical Society in northern Montana. It came from a weathered leather album donated by the Morrison family estate. The large silver gelatin print showed a wedding party standing on the steps of St. Matthew's Church on June 14, 1913. It was labeled simply Clayton Morrison Wedding 1913. The picture captured a prosperous-looking group of about 30 people arranged in formal rows, with the bride and groom centered on the church steps. Museum curator Dr. Abigail Harmon first cataloged the photograph as one of dozens of similar early 20th century wedding portraits in the collection. The Morrison family had been prominent ranchers in the region, and Charles Morrison's marriage to Elizabeth Clayton represented a union of two influential local families whose descendants still lived in the area. It was only when Dr. Harmon began the high-resolution digitization process that she noticed something unusual about the image. While the adult members of the wedding party displayed the formal, composed expressions typical of early 20th century photography, a small figure in the front row stood out dramatically from the rest. The flower girl, a child of perhaps 6 or 7 years old, stared directly at the camera with an expression of unmistakable terror. Her eyes were wide, her mouth partly open, and her small hands clutched the flower basket with white-knuckled intensity. "The child's expression is genuinely disturbing," Dr. Harmon noted in her initial catalog entry. While everyone else in the photograph maintains the composed, somewhat stern countenance typical of formal photography from this period, this little girl appears genuinely frightened. The contrast is striking enough to transform the entire mood of the image when you notice her. Even more intriguing was a small notation on the back of the photograph written in faded ink, "Complete Wedding Party," including Margaret Clayton. The deliberate inclusion of this specific child's name, when none of the other attendants were individually identified, suggested something significant about her presence that warranted documentation. This curious detail prompted Dr. Harmon to launch an investigation into the Clayton Morrison wedding and the identity of the visibly distressed flower girl who stood out so dramatically in an otherwise conventional wedding portrait. Dr. Harmon began her investigation by examining official records concerning the Clayton and Morrison families in early 20th century Willow Creek. Marriage records confirmed that Charles Morrison, 28, and Elizabeth Clayton, 22, were wed at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church on June 14, 1913, with Reverend Thomas Blackwood officiating. The marriage license listed the bride's parents as George and Catherine Clayton, prominent members of the community who owned the local bank and several commercial properties. Birth records revealed that Margaret Clayton was born on September 3, 1906, making her nearly 7 years old at the time of the wedding. She was identified as the younger sister of the bride, Elizabeth Clayton, with a 12-year age gap between the siblings. The significant age difference suggested Margaret might have been an unexpected late addition to the Clayton family. Records from St. Matthew's Church showed regular attendance by the Clayton family, including young Margaret, though a notation from early 1913 indicated she had been excused from Sunday services for a period of recovery, without specifying the nature of any illness or condition. School enrollment records showed Margaret had not yet begun formal education at the time of the wedding, despite being of typical school age, another subtle anomaly. The documentary evidence presents several small inconsistencies regarding Margaret Clayton, Dr. Harmon explained to her research assistant. While nothing indicates severe problems, these minor discrepancies suggest circumstances that deviated somewhat from the typical patterns for a child of her age and social standing. Most intriguing was a notation in the church's wedding register, where the officiating minister typically recorded basic details of the ceremony. In addition to standard information about the couple and witnesses, Reverend Blackwood had written that special arrangements were made for the younger Clayton child as requested by the family, and that the ceremony was briefly delayed due to a minor incident during the procession. This cryptic note, combined with Margaret's startled expression in the photograph, suggested that something unusual had occurred during the wedding ceremony, something significant enough to be noted in official records but not explained in detail. Dr. Harmon turned to local newspaper archives to gather more information about the Clayton Morrison wedding. As the union of two prominent families, the event had received considerable coverage in the Willow Creek Gazette, the region's primary newspaper. The June 16, 1913 edition featured a detailed account of the wedding on its society page. The article described the ceremony as one of the most lavish social events of the season, noting the church's decoration with white roses and lilies that created an atmosphere of serene elegance. It listed prominent guests, detailed the bride's satin gown with Belgian lace, and described the 5-course dinner that followed at the Clayton family home. A paragraph midway through the article provided the first clue about Margaret's situation. The bridal procession included Miss Catherine Morrison as maid of honor, with Mrs. Eleanor Thornton and Grace Sullivan as bridesmaids. Miss Margaret Clayton, younger sister of the bride, served as flower girl, overcoming her well-known timidity to perform her role admirably despite a momentary hesitation before entering the sanctuary. A separate, smaller article in the same newspaper from April 1913, 2 months before the wedding, offered additional context. It reported on a fire at the Clayton residence that had apparently been contained quickly with minimal damage. The small blaze, which began in an upstairs bedroom, was swiftly extinguished by quick-thinking household staff before the fire brigade arrived. All family members escaped without injury, though young Margaret Clayton was treated for mild smoke inhalation and shock. Dr. Wilson reported the child was recovering well but might experience heightened nervousness for some time. Most revealing was a brief society note from May 1913. Mrs. Catherine Clayton reported that preparations for her daughter Elizabeth's June wedding were proceeding apace. The event would include young Margaret as flower girl, a responsibility the child approached with mixed emotions following her recent fright. Mrs. Clayton had engaged Miss Sarah Hopkins, formerly of Boston Children's Hospital, to provide special preparation and accompaniment for Margaret during the ceremony. These newspaper accounts suggested that Margaret had experienced a traumatic event, likely the house fire, approximately 2 months before the wedding, resulting in ongoing anxiety that required special arrangements for her participation in her sister's ceremony. To better understand Margaret Clayton's apparent distress in the wedding photograph, Dr. Harmon consulted with Dr. Rebecca Foster, a child psychologist specializing in historical trauma responses at the University of Montana. Using the high-resolution digital scan of the photograph and the contextual information gathered thus far, Dr. Foster conducted a detailed analysis of Margaret's visible emotional state. The child in this photograph displays classic physical indicators of acute anxiety or fear, Dr. Foster confirmed after careful examination. Her facial expression shows widened eyes with the whites visible all around the iris, raised eyebrows, and a partly open mouth, all physiological manifestations of the fight-or-flight response. Her posture is rigid, and her hands grip the flower basket with excessive force, another indication of extreme tension. Dr. Foster explained that Margaret's expression differed significantly from the typical solemnity seen in early 20th century photography. While people often did not smile in formal photographs of this era, there is a clear difference between composed seriousness and active distress. The adults and other children show the expected formal composure, while Margaret displays genuine alarm. The psychologist noted that the newspaper accounts of a fire 2 months prior provided crucial context. Based on the historical information, this child likely experienced a significant traumatic event during the house fire. In modern terms, she appears to be displaying symptoms consistent with what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The formal wedding environment, possibly including candles or other fire elements that would have been standard in a 1913 ceremony, may have triggered a fear response related to her recent trauma. Dr. Foster also commented on the historical treatment of childhood trauma. In 1913, understanding of psychological trauma was in its infancy. Sigmund Freud had published some early work on trauma, but these ideas had hardly reached mainstream medical practice in rural Montana. The family's engagement of a nurse with hospital experience suggests they recognized Margaret needed special support, but they would have had limited framework for understanding her psychological needs beyond basic nervousness or shock. Most significantly, Dr. Foster observed that Margaret's inclusion in the wedding, despite her obvious distress, reflected early 20th century attitudes toward children's emotional experiences. Today we might excuse a child from such a public role if they were experiencing this level of anxiety. In 1913, the priority would have been fulfilling family obligations and maintaining social appearances, with children expected to perform their duties regardless of their emotional state. Dr. Harmon's research led her to a collection of Clayton family correspondence preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives. Among these materials were letters between Catherine Clayton and her sister Rebecca in Minneapolis spanning 1910 to 1920. These personal communications provided intimate insights into the family's experience before and after the wedding. In a letter dated April 22, 1913, shortly after the house fire, Catherine wrote that they had had a dreadful fright at home, though thankfully all were safe now. A lamp had overturned in Margaret's bedroom, while her nurse was momentarily absent, causing a fire that spread quickly to the curtains and bedding. The child awoke to flames and smoke, and her screams alerted the household. By the time George reached her, the room was thick with smoke, though the flames had not yet spread beyond her furnishings. Margaret was physically unharmed, save for some coughing from the smoke, but the experience had affected her terribly. She refused to sleep alone and became hysterical at the sight of even a candle or matchstick. Dr. Wilson had prescribed a mild sedative for her worst episodes and suggested time would eventually diminish these fears. A subsequent letter from May 30th, 1913, 2 weeks before the wedding, revealed growing concerns about Margaret's role in the ceremony. Elizabeth insisted that her sister participate as planned, saying a family wedding must include all family members in their proper roles. Catherine had her doubts about Margaret's readiness for such public scrutiny, as her nerves remained fragile. The child became paralyzed with fear at the mention of the church candles, though she desperately wished to please her sister. They had engaged a nurse with experience in nervous disorders to work with Margaret daily in preparation, gradually introducing her to the church environment and the sight of controlled flames. There had been progress, though Catherine worried it was insufficient for the demands of the ceremony. Most revealing was Catherine's letter written 3 days after the wedding. The day proceeded largely as planned, despite their concerns about Margaret. The child managed remarkably well through the preparations and procession practices, but became terrified upon entering the church with its many candles. She froze entirely at the sanctuary entrance, unable to move forward or back, her small face a mask of pure terror. The nurse, Miss Hopkins, quickly took her hand and whispered something that enabled Margaret to continue, though the fear never left her eyes. Elizabeth was understandably distressed by the delay but recovered her composure admirably. The photographer captured the wedding party immediately following the ceremony, and though all attempted to present a proper appearance, poor Margaret's fright remained evident. George suggested they might commission a retouched version for public display, though Catherine found she could not bring herself to erase this honest record of the day, difficult as it may be. These private communications confirmed that Margaret had experienced a traumatic fire in her bedroom approximately 2 months before the wedding, resulting in significant psychological distress that remained evident during the ceremony despite the family's careful preparations. A remarkable discovery came when Dr. Harmon located the professional papers of Sarah Hopkins, the nurse mentioned in the Clayton family letters, in the archives of the Montana Nursing Historical Association. Hopkins had been a nurse at Boston Children's Hospital before relocating to Montana in 1910, bringing with her progressive ideas about children's psychological care developed during her East Coast training. Hopkins's case notes, maintained for her private reference rather than as official medical records, included several pages dedicated to M.C., female, age 6, from May to June 1913. These notes offered a professional perspective on Margaret's condition and the approaches used to prepare her for the wedding. An entry from May 12, 1913 outlined the situation. She had been called to the Clayton home regarding the younger daughter M., age 6, suffering from a nervous condition following a bedroom fire in April. The child exhibited extreme fear response to fire in any form, including candles, matches, and even a fireplace. Physical symptoms included rapid breathing, pallor, perspiration, and occasional mutism when confronted with a fear trigger. The parents were primarily concerned with the child's ability to participate in the upcoming wedding ceremony, which would require her presence in a candlelit church. The mother showed genuine concern for the child's distress, while the father focused more on social appearances and family obligations. Hopkins documented her therapeutic approach of implementing gradual exposure techniques as learned from Dr. Morton at Children's Hospital. She began with discussions of fire safety, emphasizing control and prevention, then progressed to brief exposure to a single candle at increasing proximity, teaching breathing techniques to manage the fear response. The final stage would include accompanied visits to the church to practice the procession amid unlit, then lit candles. The child's cooperation was remarkable despite evident terror. A strong desire to please her family provided motivation despite the physiological fear response. A note from June 10th, just 4 days before the wedding, expressed concern. The rehearsal that day demonstrated limited progress. Margaret proceeded through the empty church adequately, but became immobile upon entering the fully prepared sanctuary with all candles lit. She required physical guidance and continuous verbal reassurance to complete the practice procession. Hopkins recommended to the family that the child's participation be reconsidered but met with resistance, particularly from the father and elder sister. A compromise was reached. She would walk immediately behind Margaret during the ceremony to intervene if necessary. She prepared a small lavender sachet for Margaret to hold within the flower basket, providing a calming scent as a distraction from fear triggers. Hopkins's final entry, dated June 15, 1913, reflected on the wedding itself. The ceremony proceeded despite Margaret's evident distress. The child required physical guidance to enter the sanctuary, but completed her assigned role while maintaining minimum composure. Visible trembling and facial expression revealed the fear level despite preparation, yet no outward behavioral disruption occurred. The family expressed satisfaction with the outcome, defining success as the absence of an obvious incident rather than the child's emotional experience. The photography session immediately following the ceremony captured Margaret's continued distress before Hopkins could intervene to remove her for a recovery period. She recommended continued therapeutic work addressing the fire response, though family interest might diminish now that the social obligation was completed. This case illustrated the prevailing attitude toward children's emotional needs as secondary to social requirements and adult convenience. These professional observations provided crucial context for Margaret's expression in the photograph, documenting both the therapeutic approaches available in 1913 and the limitations imposed by the social expectations of the era.